Hey, Glenn.
Wolf, how you doing, buddy?
Good. I brought you a whole bunch of more rock and roll stuff to show you. And as I told you before, when you have over 10,000 rock and roll items, this is the place, Glory Day Collectibles, that you bring your stuff to find out what it's worth. Okay, we're here back at Glory Days offices. I'm with Glenn Pye from
Glory Days Collectibles.
And we're going to talk about the history of Mapleleaf Gardens and all its early shows that happened. It's the most historical building in North America for rock and roll shows, probably in the world, that had the most iconic rock and roll bands playing.
Right.
And some of the early stars that played, like Mapleleaf Gardens opened in 1932, but in the early days it was just orchestras and dances, and Guy Lombardo, Tommy Dorsey, and Toronto Sympathy was a regular. But some notable shows that happened at Mapleleaf Gardens was Bob Hope in 1944, and also in 1944 was Roy Rogers. In 1946, Gene Autry, who were well known, and then the famous Andrews Sisters. So one of the first major bands to sell out Mapleleaf Gardens, separate from the orchestra bands, was the Andrews Sisters. And the Andrews Sisters in 1944, October 30th, sold out Mapleleaf Gardens. And this was one of their most famous hits of the 40s that the Andrews Sisters played. It was big in a lot of other movies too. And then Nat King Cole. Unforgettable. So Nat King Cole was the next major artist to sell out Mapleleaf Gardens. He did 3 shows at Mapleleaf Gardens. The first one was in 1951, October 10th, Duke Ellington and Nat King Cole. And then in 1952, September 20th, just Nat King Cole. And his third and last show that Nat King Cole did was 1953, September 26th, Nat King Cole with Sarah Vaughan. As you can see, Nat King Cole had many #1 hits, which is why he was able to sell out Mapleleaf Gardens 3 years in a row. And he also was the first Black American to host a TV variety show in the 50s, which was major.
You're so like the lady with the mystic smile.
And he had multiple Christmas hits. You can see in this one, the multiple Christmas hit is Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire, but he had many more.
Jack Frost nipping at your nose, Yuletide carols being sung by a choir, and folks dressed up like Eskimos.
But right after that, Nat King Cole knows we get into the real days of rock and roll at Mapleleaf Gardens, which started in 1956, which was Elvis, Pat Boone, Chuck Berry, Fabian, and Brenda Lee.
Right.
But one of the other classic shows, which Glenn's going to show you here, was Dick Clark's Caravan of Shows.
Right. So we talked about Elvis, of course, and one of the things that helped Mapleleaf Gardens become such a noted venue and attract so many acts is they worked hand in hand with the rock radio stations, and Chum became a very big part
of rock and roll.
The rock and roll. They were the sort of the local promoter or sponsor of all the shows that came in, which included the Dick Clark show. But in the early days, you can see when Elvis was coming, they do consecutive charts. Elvis is coming, and you'd see this. They'd help promote the shows, and then of course we showed earlier the mic. The Chum DJ introduces the act, and then they also have their mic branded with the Chum, and they get lots of good photo opportunities.
In 1957, April 2nd, Elvis Presley played in Mapleleaf Gardens. And what many people don't know is Elvis only played in 2 other countries in the world. Canada, being Mapleleaf Gardens as a historic date, and in Germany when he was in the army. Those were the only dates Elvis played except in America.
Then we go from Elvis and a couple of the unique acts that came in their own. Really, rock wasn't big enough then to just
Sell
fill a
out the
venue
gardens.
on itself. So what you do, as you said earlier, Dick Clark, he'd pull what's the top 10 for the year, and he'd get each of
He'd
those.
bring 10 of those bands to come and
Yes.
play. And this is one of the posters of Dick Clark
Right.
that he had with all his bands.
Yeah.
And this,
And he would focus on the blues acts and the early rock acts. And
so Dick Clark had 9 major shows at Mapleleaf Gardens of Caravan of Stars. And these were the greatest shows that Mapleleaf Gardens ever had, because you had 10 to 15 mega stars playing there, singing their number 1 hits at Mapleleaf Gardens. As you can see here is Buddy Holly, which was a standard at a lot of Dick Clark shows. And we're going to go into several other major hits of bands that played that you don't know the name of the band, but you know the song that was played.
Well, I love you, gal, yes, I love you, Peggy Sue.
And as we show you some of the other legendary stars that played on the Dick Clark show, this is Fats Domino's, and some people don't know the name,
My thrill,
but you know the song, Blueberry Hill.
oh, Blueberry Hill.
And then this is his other big hit, and he was a regular on Dick Clark shows. Now we'll go into Chuck Berry, who was also a regular. And this is what made the Dick Clark show, I consider, the best shows of rock and roll played in the history of rock and roll, because he had 10 stars just singing their top 3 hits. And then the next band would come on and play another group of hits, as you'll see the next star here. And this is the Drifters singing one of their big hits. And the Drifters had many, many hits. Under the Boardwalk, Up on the Roof. So they were a major band in the 50s.
Stand by me, stand by me. Bye-bye.
The greatest show of rock and roll at Mapleleaf Gardens. Like you have the Everly Brothers. All those bands played on one stage in one day.
here's another picture that hung at Mapleleaf Gardens. This is Dick Clark showing him with the lights up in the venue. That's at Mapleleaf Gardens during his show. This is the 1963 show, which again predates the real British invasion that started coming in 64. But he started these in the 50s. Wolf showed you a poster there from 58. Yeah. But they'd also jointly do a promotion with Chum. And so Chum again promoted this. You can see the mic says Chum on it. And then they started the chart. So it's like, come and see the Dick Clark Parade of Stars. Right. Here's another year. See the Dick Clark Caravan of Stars. They just changed the name of that. And then he brought some individual acts in as well. Here's one from 63. He brought Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. Now, they were just called the Four Seasons then. Frankie Valli hadn't become that famous. But now that, of course, was a CNE show, not a garden show. But again, it's a Dick Clark promotion. Here's one of him with 11,000 people. They got a picture of the crowd at this was his show from 63 as well. Then there's pictures of him on stage with various artists. And they do little local promotions. He'd probably promote one local act and do things like that. But Dick Clark, even though Alan Freed, people talk a lot about him, but DJ, but because of the power of television and everything else, Dick Clark was actually more famous than Alan Freed for most people in most cities. I'm sure in Cleveland they knew Alan Freed better, but most other cities knew Dick Clark.
So Dick Clark had many classic bands play in the 1963 tour, and we're just going to show you some of the bands and the number one hits they had. This is Brian Hyland, Sealed with a Kiss, and he also had the big hit, I'll See You in September, too. So this was one of the many stars that he brought. And Little Eva was a monster hit with Locomotion that just stayed in the number one chart for quite a while. And later on in the years, in the 70s, a couple other rock bands sang this song too. And the Ronettes She was married to Bill Spector, a famous producer of many classic songs, and this was one of the Ronettes' biggest hits, Be My Baby. And Tommy Rowe, who had many, many hits. And that's why the tour was so great, was all these guys singing 2 or 3 of their top hits and then moving over to the next guy to sing their number 1 hits. And it was one of the rarest times where Mapleleaf Gardens had so many top stars singing their top hits. And this is Len Barry from the Doorbells. And this was one of his really classic hits. 1, 2, 3, ABC.
Come on, let's fall in love. It's easy. Like taking candy from a baby.
So this is the Shirelles. They were a regular with the Dick Clark Show. They had many number 1 hits. Will You Love Me Tomorrow? Be My Baby. And Mama Said. They were all big number 1 hits. And then we get to Jimmy Clayton. He had a big number 1 hit with Venus with Blue Jeans. And had several other hits. One was Just a Dream. So 1963, July 19th, was the last Dick Clark show at Mapleleaf Gardens to play. He then moved on to the C&E and other venues. But as you can see, this was Bobby Vinton singing his monster hit, Roses Are Red.
But not as sweet as you.
Dick Clark had American Bandstand, and American Bandstand dominated the TV shows, and
Everyone watched it every Saturday afternoon, right?
And he brought the best of the early days of rock and roll, and
right into the 70s and 80s even, right?
And I'll just give you an idea. Like you'll hear the names, but you won't know all the songs. Like Frankie Valli with his big hit Venus, and Dwayne Eddy. He did Peter Gunn, and then Jimmy Clayton did Venus with Blue Jeans, and the Coasters did Searchin' and Yakety Yak, and the Drifters on the Boardwalk, Bobby Rydell, There Goes My Baby, and Wow.
I see even the Everly Brothers are on there, and of course we have something we'll show later, an autographed drumhead from the Everly Brothers. They're still, I don't know if they are now, but they were recently still touring. I'm not sure what their situation is today. But
and some of the other shows that Dick Clark brought was like this one here in '61. He had
63 is this
63.
one.
63. Well, in '61 he had Jan and Dean, and they sang Surf City, Dead Man's Curve, Little Old Lady from Pasadena.
Right.
Freddie Cannon did Tallahassee, Gary Lewis and the Playboys, This Diamond Ring, Count Me In.
People would know all these songs,
but they won't know the bands.
They wouldn't know the bands.
This is Jan and Dean. They had multiple hits. As you can see, this is Surf City. They also had the famous song Dead Man's Curve. And then later, they switched over to another number 1 hit called The Little Old Lady from Pasadena. As you can see, the best part of the Dick Clark show was just a lot of bands playing their number 1 hits and switching over. So now we're gonna...
Didn't the Beach Boys do that though?
Yeah, the Beach Boys, this band gets confused with the Beach Boys a lot of times, and the Beach Boys do some of their songs.
Everybody loves a clown. Here he is, ladies and gentlemen.
And here
my
is
son, the singer.
Gary Lewis and the Playboys. And a lot of people don't know. It's Jerry Lewis's son. And this was a big number 1 hit for Gary Lewis and the Playboys. Everyone loves a clown. And Gary Lewis had many other top 10 hits. Some of the other ones was Count Me In, and She's Just My Style, and I'm Sure Gonna Miss You. And then when we switch over to the next song, it's called This Diamond Ring. And This Diamond Ring was quite a number 1 hit for quite a while. So this is why I consider the Dave Clark tour shows one of the greatest tours at Mapleleaf Gardens, because there was just a lot of bands singing their number 1 hits. to one of the other bands that played on the 61 tour. Jam, the Zam, and the Pharaohs. And everyone knows this song.
Look at the garb that they're wearing.
Yeah. Jam the Zam, just like a good costume outfit. They had several other big hits. Little Red Riding Hood was one of the other ones. But this one was their big one, Wooly Wooly.
Isn't that Wooly Bully?
Yep. And everyone says, Wooly Wooly!
Wooly Bully.
And it was a big #1 hit for a while. And here we see Peter Gunn. Peter Gunn was a movie in the 60s, or a TV movie just like The Untouchables in the 60s. And this was a big hit. And Duane Eddy, he had many #1 guitar hits. He was a really good guitar player. And actually, this song, Peter Gunn, was also copied by Henry Mancini on one of his albums. And it became a big one. He had another couple ones called Rebel Rouser. But he was one of the other bands on the tour of 61.
His name happens to be Charlie Brown here in the performance. Ladies and gentlemen, here are the Coasters.
And the Coasters was a regular touring band with Dick Clark. Toured many, many years with them because they had many #1 hits every few years. This was one of their biggest ones, Charlie Brown. They also had that top hit, Yakety Yak, that most people know, and Poison Ivory was one of their other hits. And now we shift over to the Drifters. They also toured many of Dick Clark's tour. And this is their big hit, Under the Boardwalk. And their other really big hit too was Up on the Roof, which was a big hit and put in a few movies too.
On a blanket with my baby's where I'll be. Under the boardwalk.
Now we'll go to one of the other bands,
Talk about millions.
Freddie
dollars.
Cannon.
We've played this one a few thousand times on American Bandstand. Ladies and gentlemen, a thing called Tallahassee Lassie. Here's Freddie Cannon.
This is Freddie Cannon's big hit that he played on the tour. He also had another big hit called Way Down Yonder in New Orleans, which was another top 10 hit for him. And this is the original hit by Bobby Rydell, Volare. But a lot of people remember Dean Martin singing this song. And it was a big hit for him too. But Bobby Rydell was the original one. And he was the one that toured with the Dick Clark Show. This is why I considered the Dick Clark Show the greatest shows at Mapleleaf Gardens, because of all these different bands that you know the song, but you may not know the band. So do you remember who sang Volare? So another famous guy like Dick Clark was Alan Freed. Alan Freed and Dick Clark were the two guys doing the multiple band tours of all the top 10 or 20 hits. And as you can see, he brought a few shows to Mapleleaf Gardens, like this one, Jerry Lee, Billy, Crickets, Chuck Berry. Him and Dick Clark were the main guys of the 50s and 60s.
Back in in the day, those bands were famous amongst younger kids. This would be mainly teenagers that liked the new type of rock and roll. And of course, their parents were fighting with them. Rock and roll, even then, before the Beatles, rock and roll's bad. You shouldn't listen to this. But it was very popular amongst the kids, and most people would recognize the songs now just because they're played in grocery stores, elevators, they're everywhere. But you would know the tune, but you probably wouldn't realize the band, who was very famous at the time when they released it.
Like this tour here, a picture of 63, he had Bobby V, who sang The Night Has a Thousand Eyes, Take Good Care of My Baby, then Brian Hyland, See You in September, the Ronettes, which were hugely famous with Be My Baby, and then Little Eva, the Locomotion hits, and Dorvel's 1, 2, 3, and then Jimmy Clayton and Just a Dream, and Venus with Blue Jeans. So he took 10 or 20 bands and put them on stage and told them to sing their number 1 or 2 hits and then off the stage.
And they would do 50 big venues in North America on school buses traveling between, and they play the next city the next night. And as, again, you mentioned earlier, they only play 3 or 4 songs because you only want their hits and forget about everything else.
And back in those days, they were regular buses, nothing fancy like we have now.
No. So, once you get a hit, then you're on the list, right? At least you can start playing with them. But after a year or two, if you don't have another hit, they'll get different bands. And the Beatles, even, in fact, before they became famous in North America, which is late 63, they were playing with these bands. They put a similar tour in Europe, but they'd put in with the bands in England or Germany, Holland, wherever they're playing. This would be Chuck Berry going on tour, but he'd take a couple of the local British acts, and so the Beatles were warming up Chuck Berry, or the Beatles were warming up, whoever else went over there a lot, like the Ronettes went over there. They were way bigger than the Beatles when they started. So a lot of the rock bands got their start, including like The Who and various, which were called the High Numbers, but they all went on tours with these mainly famous black artists, but there was a few white artists, and there was a couple of big acts from England that were white, sort of early crooner rock and roll days, but they were really in 61, 2, 3, they were just introducing the real British acts, which would become powerhouses, by going on tour with these other bigger acts at the time.
So that section was basically from the 50s to 1964, the British invasion and the American invasion of Mapleleaf Gardens.
In person, you'll see and hear Major Lance.
So as we end the air of the Dick Clark show at Mapleleaf Gardens, there were several other big bands that showed up between 1956 and 63 at Mapleleaf Gardens. So as we go down memory lane of the Dick Clark tour, we're going to show you some pictures of the buses that toured with them. And they crowded everybody in the bus, and they weren't like tour buses we know now. It was you just get a seat in the bus.
8:30 p.m. Here's where you can get your advance tickets now.
So here we have Bill Haley and the Comets with his monster hit, Rock Around the Clock. This was the first considered rock and roll band of the 50s that was considered rock and roll. And he dominated the arenas and shows playing Rock Around the Clock and several other hits. And his show at Mapleleaf Gardens was 1956, April 30th. Show you some posters and pictures of Mapleleaf Gardens also. So on July 16th, 1956, Carl Perkins, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Frankie Lemon, and a few other acts showed up at Mapleleaf Gardens for a classic rock show. Early version of Little Richard, who was always a great piano player.
Good golly, Miss Molly, sure like the bone. Good golly, Miss Molly, sure like the bone. When you're rocking out the rock,
And it's Frankie had a young big hit there that was always on a lot of the Dick Clark tour shows.
How old was he?
16 or something like that at this age. He was very young tour. This is the Cliftons. This was their biggest hit that they had. And put them on a lot of Dick Clark shows with the Heart and Soul song. In fact, they were just on PBS doing a documentary of their hit. And Heart and Soul was the number one. So Pat Boone was another favorite at Mapleleaf Gardens in 1957. May 25th, he sold out there. And Ain't That a Shame and Mooney River was his other big hits.
Ladies and gentlemen, here's Chubby
Look how young Dick Clark looks here. And he's introducing Chubby Checkers, which he toured a lot with and set up some tours. And Chubby Checkers played in 1962, February 19th at Mapleleaf Gardens, doing his big hit, The Twist. So as we finish the early 60s with the Dick Clark Show of Stars or Caravan Show of Stars, we're just going to show you some of the show posters. Even though they may not be Mapleleaf Gardens, they're the tour show posters of that tour. This one, Sam Cooke was the main star in 1960. Dion was there with the Belmonts. He was a regular on a lot of the Dick Clark shows. And we're going to show you a few other bands that played, even though on some of the show posters you'll see Chubby Checkers and Bobby Rydell and the Crystals. There were a few other bands that showed up. This guy was the other Elvis of the 50s, Fabian, but didn't last long. And Brenda Lee, one of the youngest girl singers going. She was on a lot of shows with Dick Clark, and this is her famous Christmas song, Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree. And Roy Orbison appeared on a few of Dick Clark's shows. He was definitely a legendary singer. This is his biggest hit, Pretty Woman. And this is Frankie Avalon. He was on a lot of Dick Clark shows. I'm showing you some of the movies he did that made Frankie famous. And of course, you'll see in a few minutes Annette Funicello, who also toured with him singing songs. And the Isley Brothers were shouting. The Dick Clark Show had quite a variety of 50s, 60s artists tour with him over and over again. And here's Del Shannon with his famous Palisade Park song, or Freddie Can. That's where the girls are. I took a ride on a shooty shoe. That girl I sat beside was awful cute. Palisade Park was a very popular park in upstate New York. In a rare appearance of Cliff Richards. Cliff Richards, he was the Elvis of England. Had a lot of hits and toured a few times with the Dick Clark Show. And not many people know, but Dick Clark played with the Shadows. Shadows had a lot of famous songs like Apache. And Dick Clark over the years did a few reunions with them. And Dick Clark was also a good guitar player. And this is September 1861. Barry in the U.S. bonds. Now, as you see the show posters, you'll see Chuck Berry and a lot of the other regulars on there, but we just thought we'd throw in some of the other bands that weren't on the multiple tours. And Dion, he had lots of hits. This is his big hit, Runaway. My little runaway. Paul Anka, October 1st, 61. He played many Dick Clark shows too. And he's our big Canadian addition to the Dick Clark show.
Oh, I was only
Gene Pitney played in the 1963 Dick Clark show. He had a bunch of good hits. His voice is pretty familiar to know.
And stop to rest for the night.
And the Chorales, the Crystals, and this one here came. Crystals did many tours also with Dick Clark. And this is the 1963 tour. So one of the other things we're going to have on our webpage is a map and program of all the concerts that played at Mapleleaf Gardens. And we're going to put this on our webpage, and you can look it up, and you'll see all the British, American, and international and Canadian acts that play that we cataloged. We did some corrections in the book and on the webpage that aren't shows that didn't appear there, or shows that they said appeared there, but we know they never happened. So the book has some corrections that needs to be done, some shows added, and the webpage that we found on Mapleleaf Gardens had a lot of mistakes on shows on it. But we will publish this on our webpage of all the shows that happened in Mapleleaf Gardens from 1935 to 1999 when Mapleleaf Gardens closed down.